In 1945, American forces discovered something in Japanese-occupied China that was so horrific, the U.S. government classified it for decades. Imagine walking into a facility where thousands of people were systematically tortured and killed in the name of science, where children were infected with deadly diseases just to see how fast they would die, where human beings were frozen alive, dissected while conscious, and subjected to experiments that would make Nazi doctors look tame. This isn't fiction. This is Unit 731, and Japan tried to erase it from history forever. The year was 1936. Japan had just invaded Manchuria and was looking to expand its empire across Asia. But unlike other military operations, this one had a secret weapon that would change the face of warfare forever. Deep in the forests of Pingfang, near Harbin in northeastern China, construction began on what would become one of history's most deadly research facilities. The man behind this operation was Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, a brilliant microbiologist who convinced the Japanese military that biological weapons would give them an unstoppable advantage. Ishii wasn't just interested in creating weapons. He wanted to test them on living human subjects to see exactly how effective they could be. What started as a research unit quickly grew into a massive complex covering over 150 buildings. The Japanese called it the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. The name was deliberately boring, designed to hide its true purpose, but its real designation was Unit 731, and it would become a factory of human suffering that operated for 9 years. The facility looked innocent enough from the outside. Clean white buildings, well-maintained grounds, and official government signage that suggested legitimate medical research. But beneath this facade was something far more sinister. The Japanese had built the perfect cover for conducting experiments that violated every principle of human decency. Ishii recruited some of Japan's brightest medical minds to work at the facility. Around 3,000 doctors, nurses, and researchers were told they were serving their country by advancing medical science. Many believed they were doing important work that would save Japanese lives. They had no idea they were about to become participants in systematic murder. The subjects of these experiments weren't volunteers. They were Chinese civilians, prisoners of war, Russians, Koreans, and Mongolians. Men, women, and children as young as 3 years old were brought to Unit 731 to die in the name of science. The researchers had a special name for these victims. They called them maruta, which means logs in Japanese. They were treated like pieces of wood rather than human beings. The facility could hold 600 prisoners at once, but the turnover was constant. As soon as one group died from the experiments, another would be brought in to replace them. It was an assembly line of death disguised as scientific research. The experiments began with biological weapons testing. Researchers would inject prisoners with anthrax, plague, cholera, and other deadly diseases. They would then carefully document every stage of the infection process. How long did it take for symptoms to appear? How much pain did the subjects experience? How quickly did they die? But the biological weapons testing was just the beginning. The researchers at Unit 731 were curious about the limits of human endurance. They conducted frostbite experiments where prisoners were taken outside in freezing temperatures and had water poured over their arms and legs until they froze solid. The researchers would then test different methods of thawing to see which caused the most damage. Other prisoners were placed in hypobaric chambers to simulate high-altitude conditions. The researchers would slowly reduce the air pressure until the victims' eyes popped out of their skulls and their internal organs began to rupture. All of this was carefully documented with photographs and detailed notes. Perhaps most horrifying were the vivisection experiments. Prisoners would be infected with diseases and then cut open while still alive and conscious. No anesthesia was used because the researchers wanted to see how the diseases affected living organs. They would remove hearts, lungs, and other organs from conscious victims and observe how long they could survive. Women were not spared from these horrors. Pregnant women were infected with diseases to see how they would affect unborn children. Some were forced to give birth, and then both mother and child would be subjected to further experiments. The researchers showed no mercy based on age or gender. The scope of Unit 731's operations extended far beyond the main facility. Ishii created a network of related units across Asia, including Unit 100, Unit 1644, and others, each specialized in different types of biological and chemical weapons research. Together, they formed a massive program dedicated to turning disease into a weapon of war. But Unit 731 wasn't content to simply test these weapons in laboratories. They wanted to see how effective they would be in real combat situations. Starting in 1940, they began conducting field tests on Chinese cities and villages. The Japanese developed several methods for delivering biological weapons. They created porcelain bombs filled with plague-infected fleas that would shatter on impact and release the insects into populated areas. They also contaminated food and water supplies with deadly bacteria and dropped infected materials from aircraft over civilian targets. The results were devastating. Conservative estimates suggest that between 200,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians died from these biological attacks. Entire villages were wiped out by plague outbreaks that were deliberately started by Unit 731. The Japanese had turned disease into a weapon of mass destruction. One of the most effective weapons was plague-infected fleas. The researchers at Unit 731 developed a method for breeding millions of these fleas and infecting them with bubonic plague. They would then release them over Chinese cities using specially designed bombs. Within weeks, plague outbreaks would begin killing thousands of people. The Japanese also experimented with anthrax, cholera, typhoid, and other diseases. They tested different delivery methods and studied how quickly the diseases would spread through populations. All of this research was paid for with human lives. Now here's where the story gets even more disturbing. If you think this sounds bad, you need to subscribe because what happened next will change how you see World War II history forever. As the war began to turn against Japan, the researchers at Unit 731 knew they were in trouble. By 1945, Soviet forces were advancing into Manchuria, and it was only a matter of time before they discovered the facility. But instead of surrendering and facing justice, the Japanese made a decision that would haunt history. Ishii ordered his staff to destroy all evidence of their crimes. Buildings were blown up, documents were burned, and equipment was demolished. But most shocking of all, they murdered every remaining prisoner to eliminate witnesses. Men, women, and children who had survived the experiments were killed to cover up the evidence. The staff members were ordered to take the secret to the grave. They were told never to speak about what they had done at Unit 731. Most of them returned to Japan and resumed normal lives as if nothing had happened. But some evidence survived. When Soviet forces finally reached the facility, they found enough proof to understand what had been happening there. In 1949, the Soviets held the Khabarovsk trials where 12 Unit 731 members were sentenced to labor camps. However, the sentences were surprisingly light and most returned to Japan within just a few years. Meanwhile, something even more shocking was happening with the Americans. Instead of prosecuting the war criminals from Unit 731, the United States government made a deal with them. In exchange for all of their research data, the Americans granted immunity to key figures including Ishii himself. The U.S. military wanted the biological weapons research for their own programs. They were willing to let mass murderers go free in exchange for scientific data that could give them an advantage in future conflicts. This decision meant that most of the people responsible for Unit 731's crimes never faced justice. For decades, the full truth about Unit 731 remained classified. The American government kept the details secret to protect their sources and their own biological weapons programs. It wasn't until the 1980s that researchers began to uncover the full extent of what had happened. Even Japan's own government tried to suppress the truth. It took until 2002 for Japan's Tokyo District Court to officially recognize the state's role in biological warfare. And it wasn't until 2018 that Japan's National Archives released a nearly complete list of 3,607 Unit 731 personnel. The total death toll from Unit 731's operations is staggering. Between 3,000 and 14,000 people died within the facility itself, with higher estimates including the affiliated units. But when you add in the field testing and biological attacks on civilian populations, the number climbs to over 300,000 deaths. These weren't soldiers who died in combat. These were innocent civilians, prisoners, and victims who were murdered in the name of scientific advancement. Unit 731 represents one of the darkest chapters in human history, where medical knowledge was twisted into an instrument of mass murder. The story of Unit 731 raises uncomfortable questions about how science can be weaponized without ethical oversight. It shows what happens when researchers abandon their humanity in pursuit of knowledge and military advantage. The victims were dehumanized to the point where they were literally called logs instead of people. What makes Unit 731 even more chilling is the cold, calculated nature of the research. These weren't random acts of violence or crimes of passion. Every experiment was carefully planned, documented, and analyzed. The researchers treated human suffering like data points on a chart. They published papers about their findings and presented their work at conferences as if they were studying laboratory rats instead of human beings. The facility operated with military precision. Each department had specific roles and responsibilities. Some focused on breeding disease-carrying insects. Others specialized in developing new delivery methods for biological weapons. There were teams dedicated to documenting the effects of various pathogens on human subjects. The entire operation was organized like a legitimate research institution, complete with detailed records and scientific protocols. One of the most disturbing aspects was how normal everything appeared to the outside world. The staff lived in comfortable housing near the facility. Their families joined them in Harbin, creating a small community of researchers and their loved ones. Children played in the streets while their parents conducted unspeakable experiments just a few miles away. The contrast between normal family life and the horrors happening at the facility shows how easily evil can hide behind a facade of normalcy. The Japanese government provided unlimited funding for Unit 731's operations. No expense was spared in the pursuit of biological weapons superiority. The facility had state-of-the-art equipment, the best medical professionals, and access to unlimited human subjects. It was a researcher's dream come true, built on the suffering of innocent people. The psychological impact on the researchers themselves is another disturbing element of this story. How do normal human beings transition from healing the sick to torturing prisoners? The answer lies in a combination of nationalism, dehumanization, and gradual moral compromise. The researchers were told they were serving their country and advancing medical knowledge. They were encouraged to think of their victims as subhuman enemies who deserved whatever happened to them. Over time, many of the researchers became completely desensitized to human suffering. They could watch someone die in agony and immediately move on to the next experiment without showing any emotion. This psychological transformation from healer to killer reveals something deeply troubling about human nature and the power of institutional pressure to corrupt moral judgment. The Japanese military used Unit 731's research in ways that went far beyond the laboratory. They incorporated biological weapons into their overall military strategy for conquering China. Plague outbreaks became just another tool of war, like artillery or airstrikes. The Japanese command structure treated biological warfare as a legitimate military tactic rather than a war crime. The coordination between Unit 731 and regular military forces was extensive. Army units would request specific types of biological weapons for particular targets. The researchers would then customize their delivery methods based on local conditions and strategic objectives. This level of integration between the scientific community and the military shows how deeply embedded these programs were in Japan's war machine. Intelligence gathered from Unit 731's experiments influenced Japanese military planning throughout the war. The knowledge of how diseases spread through populations helped them target civilian areas more effectively. Understanding the timeline of various infections allowed them to coordinate biological attacks with conventional military operations. The research literally became a weapon of war that killed hundreds of thousands of people. The international implications of Unit 731 extended far beyond World War II. The biological weapons research conducted there influenced military thinking for decades afterward. The Cold War arms race included significant investment in biological weapons programs by both the United States and Soviet Union, much of it based on knowledge gained from Unit 731's experiments. The moral compromises made by the American government in dealing with Unit 731 personnel set a dangerous precedent. By prioritizing scientific knowledge over justice, they sent a message that war crimes could be overlooked if the perpetrators had valuable information. This decision haunted American foreign policy for decades and raised questions about the true costs of national security. The cover-up of Unit 731's crimes also demonstrates how historical narratives can be manipulated by powerful interests. For nearly 4 decades, the full truth about these experiments remained hidden from public view. Textbooks didn't mention them, war museums ignored them, and government officials denied they ever happened. It took persistent efforts by journalists, historians, and survivors to finally bring this story to light. But here's what really should keep you awake at night. Many of the researchers from Unit 731 went on to have successful careers in post-war Japan. They became university professors, government health officials, and respected members of society. Some founded pharmaceutical companies and medical research institutions that still exist today. The knowledge gained from torturing and murdering thousands of innocent people helped advance their careers and build their fortunes. Shiro Ishii himself never faced trial for his crimes. He lived comfortably in Japan until his death in 1959, protected by his deal with American intelligence. Other key figures from Unit 731 became leaders in Japan's post-war medical establishment. They trained new generations of doctors and researchers, passing on their knowledge while hiding the horrific origins of their expertise. And that research data the Americans traded immunity for? It formed the foundation of the U.S. biological weapons program during the Cold War. The suffering of Unit 731's victims didn't just benefit Japan. It gave the United States a head start in developing their own weapons of mass destruction. American scientists built upon experiments conducted on Chinese civilians to create even more deadly biological agents. The pharmaceutical companies founded by former Unit 731 researchers went on to develop legitimate medical treatments that saved lives. The same hands that once injected children with deadly diseases later created vaccines and antibiotics. This moral contradiction shows how scientific knowledge can be simultaneously beneficial and tainted by its origins. What's even more disturbing is how this pattern has repeated throughout history. When powerful governments want scientific knowledge, they're often willing to overlook how that knowledge was obtained. The question isn't whether this could happen again. It's whether it's happening right now in places we don't know about yet.